Good morning, everyone. I hope you're celebrating your Easter Sunday well. And for those of you who have already stockpiled a few of these videos and have decided to watch the Easter series, the two-part Easter series today, that's great. And hopefully you've already gone through the first talk, which, of course, being Good Friday, was naturally a talk about the call that Christ placed over our lives, that if we're to follow him, we would need to deny ourselves, take up our cross, and go after that to find life would be in giving it up. So the focus really, of course, being the day on which Christ was crucified, was on this death principle, if you like, this we must die to ourselves if we are really going to follow Christ. And a personal testimony to and being called into pastoral ministry, experiencing that self-death, and the decline that comes in following Christ for us in the way that we've been called is a deepening experience of what Christ was saying. Nowhere near what others have experienced. Some literally gave up their life, have died in service to Christ, have died in his name, and we haven't shed blood, but we've shed a lot of sweat and tears and a lot of emotional and spiritual agony, and certainly a decline in our place in this world. And so I put the first talk mainly into the context of my own life in that sense, and I hope you can forgive me for that, but I just wanted to offer myself up as a sacrifice in that way, if you like. But this one really, of course, is reflecting on the resurrection of Christ. Being Easter Sunday, that's what you'd expect me to do. And naturally, in watching the first talk, you might have had the thought, but Philip, there is an empty tomb and an empty cross. That a skull, as someone quite rightly pointed out, is a reminder of continual death, and the tomb of Christ is empty. And that's absolutely true. And I affirm that and cling to that hope, cling to that truth that Christ's cross is empty and his tomb is empty. Nevertheless, I also reflect on the fact that as far as resurrection life is concerned, there has only been one resurrection in human history, and that is Christ's resurrection. That every other tomb of any other human is full. There is no tomb other than Christ's that is empty. And even those who were brought back to life, anyone in scriptural history, anyone in modern history, all have or will die unless Christ comes back before we die and gives us resurrection life. Resurrection life is very different. Being brought back from the dead is called resuscitation, not resurrection. So the question, I guess, is what life are we talking about? Because in thinking about the resurrection life, the call Christ made to his disciples, that whoever believed in him would pass from death into life, not in some future terms, but in some today terms, that there was to be an experience now, even as Paul would say, that he died in Christ so that he could live for Christ. So he's calling us to live in and for Christ. So it needs to be rightly balanced, this talk about death, with the offer and the hope and the expectation of a life in God now. So I really want to talk about that, and this may mercifully be shorter than the previous one, part 2 maybe, but we'll see. So, death is a tyrant that has been broken in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. All right? He died, and death had hold of him, and then he was brought back to life, raised to resurrection life, and death is broken. Not just because he was raised to life, but because he's been given an eternal and forever existent life, that his body, which he still has, cannot see death or decay anymore. So death has no hold on Christ. Therefore, death's power has ultimately been broken. So that's the great hope, and that's the thing we celebrate every year. But the fact that we celebrate it every year is also a reminder of a truth, that though death has been broken and its power ultimately ended, a defeated foe, nevertheless, still a foe on the battlefield. And every tomb is full, except for Christ's. But I will die, you will die, and everyone before us and throughout human history has died or is soon to die as well. So the foe of death is defeated, but we still must face it, and we face it every day. And the way we face it really, I guess, is the question of how we live. So I want to talk about the question of life as something that we universally desire. But in universally desiring it, we don't universally describe it the same way. And that when Christ offered the abundant life, as in John, I have come to give you life and life to the full, nevertheless he was still crucified, which seems odd, doesn't it? When we universally want to live, we see death as a tyrant quite literally because we don't want to die. We want to live forever. And we have this yearning in us. I love the phrase in Ecclesiastes that God has set eternity in the hearts of humanity. We have this sense that we want to live forever and that it would be right to live forever. We're made for that. There's a yearning in us. And that's universal. That is not just a Christian thing. It is a universal thing. And so we see death as a tyrant because it takes from us the hope of eternal life. But that doesn't mean that life, therefore, in any form is benign or good. That life in any form will be good life. We all seek a good life. But do we all find it? And so there's the question. We cannot just say God has died through Christ and in Christ so that we can live, and therefore describe any way we live as good and God ordained. That's simply too simplistic. Indeed, I would like to suggest that you think about life as another tyrant if it's not properly appropriated. After all, if death is a tyrant, it's the stick to our life, the threat. But life itself can be a carrot that can also control us. If we seek to avoid death, we might also seek to procure some things in life that become another hold on us. For instance, I have this beautiful home. We call the things that we have possessions. We possess these things. But at what point do the possessions possess us? At what point do we recognize that in losing the thing that I have, that I value, my life will be thrown into complete disarray, that I don't feel I could sustain that loss? This home, as I think I've already mentioned, we live in it on the gracious gifts of other people and timely gifts at times when our finances have run dry. And I won't go into the stories, but we don't live in this house because we can manage the mortgage. We live in this house by the grace of God. And I mean that quite literally because my wife and I both, early on in our pastoral journey, both began to pray quite earnestly, Lord, should we in fact sell the house? We were doing this separately. Should we sell the house? Should we downsize? Should we live within our means? That would be the wise thing to do, the normal thing you'd expect to do. And after a weekend of prayer individually, not realizing we were both doing this, we came together on the Sunday afternoon and began to talk about the journey we'd both been on, to discover that we'd both been on it at the same time, asking the very same question, offering up to God the very same prayer. And we had the same answer, the very same answer. And the answer was this. The Lord said, yes, you can sell the house and you can live within your means, but I'd like you to know you will no longer be living by faith. So I don't know how you'd respond to that. There's an obvious kind of wahoo, we don't have to leave this place because this is a nice home and this was the best home by far we've ever lived in, and we didn't want to lose it. And nevertheless, we knew that we couldn't hold on to it by our own strength. We didn't have the resources. Our pockets aren't deep enough. And if we were going to stay here, it would mean trusting God that He was good enough to give us this good gift, but in fact that He would have to, that we would come dry many times and have come dry many times, and God has come through time and time again. So we live here not because this is our house, but because this is His house gifted to us that we can stay in as long as He's happy for us to be here, as long as it's still His will for us to live in this place. And when it no longer is, then we will leave. As many of you know, the circumstances of our lives right now, our income's even lower than it has been in the past, perhaps the lowest it's ever been. And yet here we are still, facing the decision that we had to face. The question, of course, was asked, does that mean I can continue in the pastoral ministry? It just simply doesn't pay enough. And again, we went through the prayer process, and it was very clear to me, I have a calling, and the Lord has not lifted that to any degree, and I am to stay doing what I'm doing until God says otherwise. And everything else is in His control and His to manage. And so here we still are, committed to being faithful to God as a pastor. Now, if I defined life as having all that I want, as having the house of my dreams, having control over my destiny, as having the means to buy a new car when the old car becomes too old, when having even the means to fix the car that I've got. If I define life and an abundant life according to my own terms, then it makes no sense to be a pastor. It makes no sense to do what I'm doing and what I have been doing for some time now, several years. And if I define my life on those terms of what I would like to enjoy in life, then that becomes a new tyrant in my life, because I will follow whatever it is that my heart desires now. That the life I want will become the life I need, and if I don't get it, I will feel like I'm not in life at all and not enjoying the abundant life, and I'll begin to blame God for all the things I don't have and wished I did have. So life becomes a tyrant. It's the carrot. If death is the stick, life can become the carrot, the thing that we pursue, that then becomes the enticement at the end of our nose that we can never reach and yet run after blindly, saying, I just want a good life, and God has ordained that life be good and full and abundant. So desiring life is good and right, and we are made for it. We are made for eternal life. But defining life, that's the key. Christ was not crucified because He offered the abundant life. He was crucified because He defined what abundant life looked like in terms that we find difficult, almost impossible to swallow with any real ease. It is the defined life that made Peter turn on Jesus and say, there's no way you're allowed to die on the cross. That's not your future. You cannot. And in which Christ had to turn to one of His chief disciples and say, get behind me, Satan. You do not have the thoughts of God, but of man. So we must be very, very careful when we talk about Christ has given us the abundant life. If we fail to define it according to the cross of Christ, because as soon as we take the cross out of the life of the Christian, then we might as well be pagans. We might as well define life simply by, I want to live as best I can, and then leave it up to ourselves to define what the best I can looks like. But I believe that Christ defines life very specifically and very clearly, and it is simply this: faithfulness. The abundant life that Christ offers is the adventure of faith, the adventure of trusting God alone and solely and with all your heart. The abundant life Christ lived and demonstrated was the life of giving up everything and doing whatever the Father asked of us. And that may look like, for you, it may look like material success as well. It may look like wealth, a big home, a nice car. If faithfulness looks like God gives you gracious gifts, then who am I to judge? The only one who can really know who is being faithful, well, I was about to say you are the only one who knows. But here's the trick. We trick ourselves. Faithfulness needs to be determined not by one person's sole decision, but by a community decision. That faithfulness to the life of Christ, because it's so difficult, because it's so antithetical to the way we'd like to live, because it cuts across our yearning to live forever, that it demands of us that we learn to die well. One of my favourite theologians, Stanley Hauerwas, would say that the purpose of the church, and therefore the purpose of a pastor, is to help people die before they die. That we are teaching one another in the church to die and prepare for our death, not simply in terms of that we would stand before God on Judgment Day with a clean slate, because of course no one gets to heaven with a clean slate. We're all sinners, and we'll all go to heaven sinners. No, what I think he's meaning is that to live well, to live the way that Christ is calling us to live, the way that he lived, will require dying to our egos and to our ambitions and to our self-grasping yearning to try and save our own lives and avoid the death that is essential, necessary for resurrection. And that we need a community to help teach us to do that. So faithfulness in our lives is the central importance, and it's going to require a community of people who are willing to be faithful in their honesty and their truthfulness to us about whether we're self-deceiving. I mentioned earlier that I felt that the call of Christ on my life to be a pastor was still present no matter our material situation. And yet I still maintain a submission to the community on that. That may be how I feel. But if the church begins to say, we don't feel that the call is still on your life, Philip, then I would need to listen to that. And I would need to submit to that. I mean, it would be a bit foolish if I didn't. But that's the hard thing for us to do. Not only to live the faithful life, but to live the committed one another life. That is also part of the faithful life. That helps train us in ways of Christ living rather than self-centered living. A community helps knock ourselves out of the center, and a Christian community helps place God into the center of our universe so that we know that we're not on the throne anymore, but he is. We need a community for that. So I was about to say you are the only one who can know if you're being faithful. I would like to recant that, and I'm glad I didn't quite get to that point, because in a sense it just demonstrates how self-centered we really are, that we would even think we could define faithfulness by our own terms and without the need of a community to help us define that. So I'd like to pose that question to you. You're living the good life. You want to live the good life. Some of that is a yearning, no, all of that is a yearning of God in us to live well. God is life itself. But are we handling that well? Are we allowing the world to set the terms of that life? Or are we submitting ourselves faithfully to God so that our life reflects Christ more and more rather than me? That in the words of John the Baptist, I must become less so that he can become more. Where are you at on that journey this Easter Sunday? Thanks for tuning in. God bless. Hope to see you soon. It wouldn't have been the same without you, and I'm so glad you're in my life.